name is Gary Eagle, and in this video I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story, my spiritual journey, and how I began to see myself separate from my personality, and how I grew spiritually over a 63-year journey. I'm going to discuss 4 main areas of my life during the video, and these aspects are going to be the one which is most dear to my heart, which is God and awareness. So that is the focus of this video. I'm also going to discuss a little about my family. The most important person in my family is my wife Janet. We've been married 43 years. We have 4 children, 2 girls and 2 boys. And my children have given me 6 beautiful grandchildren. My family is held together by my wife, who, without her love and assistance, my life as it is wouldn't have been possible. I'm going to discuss a little bit about my career, not very much, but my career did cause us to move around a little bit and to go to different countries. I was a mechanical engineer, became a facilities manager, became a tattoo artist, and then created a tattoo training college. My hobby is primarily computer programming. I'm proficient in 9 languages and began programming in 1975 and enjoy coding to this day. The other and final segment of the parts of my life which I'm going to discuss in this video is sport. I wasn't much of a sportsman, but I did judo for more than 17 years, and it was very influential in my growth and development in my story. As with every story, it's probably best to start in the beginning. So I was born at 11 p.m. on the 23rd of November 1958, and I was born in a hospital in Durban, South Africa. Now, what was unusual about my birth is that I was born with a caul. So a caul is like a sack which covers a baby's head. This particular piece of skin that grows over the face is said to be a spiritual sign of the person's psychic ability, and it has magical properties. Sailors for years carried a caul with them on board ship, and because of its great value, mine was stolen in hospital. So before we left, it was already stolen. The other thing about my birth is that I was born in a Catholic hospital, but I was delivered by a Jewish doctor who insisted that I should be circumcised in the tradition of Jewish law. My mother chose my name, Gary, after Gary Player, a famous and influential South African spokesperson and an international golfer. But when my grandfather walked into the hospital room and laid his eyes on me, the first thing he said was, "I'm going to call him Gary Eagle." And he continued to call me that until the day he passed away. And after that, every company that we started, we began with the word Eagle, and the name has been very close to me my entire life. My family belonged to the Church of England, and so I was raised in a Christian faith. I was christened, later baptized. My mother was a practicing Christian, took me to the Methodist Church, made sure I went to Sunday school. Later on, I continued with Guild as a teenager. At this point, I had a fairly normal formative years. However, once I started going to school, things started to go a little bit wrong. My parents moved a lot, and so in the 12 years of my standard schooling, I went to 13 different schools. What this meant was that I never made any friends, and was always the new person. And this resulted in me being picked on and bullied quite a lot until my judo became to a level where I was beyond being picked on. But not only were the children unkind to me, but some of the schools that my mother insisted I go to were Catholic schools. So I went to St. Henry's College, and at St. Henry's there was a brother Anthony, and he used to beat me regularly because I couldn't speak Latin to the level that he considered necessary. I went to another Christian monk school called La Salle College, and there the educators, the teachers were kind to me, but the students were very unkind because I was English speaking in an Afrikaans Dutch college. My father believed in God but did not believe in religion. So this had a bit of a turn for me in my understanding of God and spirituality. Now, the reason for my father's difference in beliefs than the rest of the family, and certainly my mother's side of the family, was in 1935. He was desperately ill, and doctors couldn't find any way of curing him, and they gave up, and the priests were called to the house, and he was going to die. In desperation, my gran heard about a place called Pendle Hill, which was not too far from our family home in Blackburn, where there was a white magician, or if you like, a witch. So my gran took my desperately ill father and went to Pendle Hill, and this is the home of the Pendle witch trials in 1612, and they were still practicing witches there. And when she took my father there, they performed some rituals, and provided him with some herbs and herbal medicine, and he was cured. And from that day, my father had an affinity to believe there was more than what was offered by Christianity mainstream. So my father spent many years, many evenings, telling me stories of his youth. My father was a champion at table tennis and his service in the Second World War. When I was 10 years old, my father taught me self-hypnosis. Hypnosis is a process of deliberate sleep. Normally there's a hypnotist and a subject, but self-hypnosis is slightly different because the hypnotist and the subject are the same person. So in order to do this, you have to develop a strong inner voice. This inner voice will hypnotize the mind. And by keeping focus on the voice, you can keep your awareness while your body is put into a trance, if you like. And slowly you can disconnect your senses. So you can disconnect your bodily senses, your hearing, which is very difficult, your vision, and finally you can disconnect completely from your body and just be in your mind. This state I call a twilight state of consciousness, where you are present but the mind is silent. So I perfected this as a youngster, and my father took me to see Romark, the hypnotist. He's a world famous hypnotist and he developed a technique called HypnoThink, and his wife Ursula Markham wrote a book on it. So with this firm mental grounding, I learnt a different approach to the spiritual process. Because I was always moving, my world revolved around my parents. Because without staying in any one place for more than a few months, I never developed friendships. So most of the time I was a real estate agent like my parents. I'm talking about when I was 8 years old. On a particular day when I was 8, a man by the name of Joe Knutzer. Now Joe was a 6th Dan in judo, and when he came to this house that I was showing on behalf of my parents, he saw this sorry excuse of a boy. I never had a single muscle anywhere on my body. Well, obviously I had muscles, but you couldn't see them. I had bones, definitely no muscles. And he spoke to my parents and said, "What sport does this boy play?" And my parents said I was a scout, and he thought that was hilarious because I was a sea scout 600 kilometers from the sea. So I began doing judo under Joe's guidance. At age 14 I became a senior black belt, and then went on to compete in the South African Champions. I was national champion for more than 7 years. And I then travelled to England and trained with the British Olympic team. And I met some of the greats such as Brian Jacks, Neil Adams, Dave Starbrook, and many other Olympic athletes. I was trained by Willem Rushka, a Dutchman who was world champion. I learned Shukukai karate. I created the first Kung Fu school in South Africa, teaching North Siu Lam Kung Fu. And I studied Tai Chi with my father, and we practiced inner body work. And then later I used visualization and meditation in order to help me train. Now, Christianity had a major impact on me growing up. So I went to Catholic schools in the beginning. My family was Anglican, so all events, marriages, christenings, those sorts of things were all Anglican. And as a teenager, I grew up going to the Methodist Church. As a teen, I went to the Guild, and in my later teens, I went on a spiritual retreat in the Drakensberg Gardens with about 200 Christians. And this was my first encounter with let's call it a spiritual event. Now, this profound moment was life-changing. And I'm not going to harp on it because it's unimportant to anyone other than myself. But this began a struggle in me because the belief and dogma of Christianity at that point in time, which I was exposed to, was in contradiction to my spiritual event, which was a Christian spiritual event. So I had a bit of a problem with this. I began to practice spiritual healing, and on a particular occasion, let's say it could have been an angel, it could have been a ghost, but one particular day I was standing on the side of a freeway and I was hitchhiking, and a man appeared. There was no people anywhere. I'd been dropped in a very remote place, and a man appeared on the road and he walked towards me. And when he got next to me, we had a small conversation, and then he bid me farewell and he continued walking. And I looked to see if there was a car coming because I was hitchhiking, and when I looked back, the man was gone. But there was nowhere to go. Not within 10 kilometers was there any place for the man to disappear. But he was gone, nowhere to be seen. I looked all over and I couldn't find him. So I went to go and see a minister to ask for spiritual guidance. Instead, I received moralizing and judgment. And this type of activity was shunned by the church, and clearly it was an evil event. Now, perhaps it was my own expectation, but I felt that I was not being aided. I had not done anything evil. I had not attempted to do anything. This event had occurred to me, and I wanted help. But there was no help forthcoming. So I realized I needed to look in a different place for this assistance. After I completed school, I went to Rhodes University in a city called Grahamstown. Now, Grahamstown's pretty unique in that it has 52 churches. That means every single week you can go to church in a different church. So I wouldn't say that at this point in time I was such a good Christian that I would attend a different church for the sole purpose of prayer. But each of these churches used to have tea and cake after the ceremony, and it would be absolutely a highlight of my week to go and have tea and cake at a different church every Sunday. Now, what was special about Grahamstown is that on a particular day I went to the cinema. I went alone, and there was a nondescript movie just which I couldn't possibly recall because it was of no significance. But when I came out of the cinema, the rain was pouring down, but absolutely pelting down. And so I stood for about 10 or 15 minutes under the canopy of the cinema, and by then everybody else was gone. They'd all made a run for it, except that I had a 3-kilometer walk from the cinema to my university dorm, and there was absolutely no chance of making a dash for it. So eventually I realized this rain is not stopping, and decided that I would just walk in the rain. Fortunately, it wasn't cold. It was a pleasant enough evening, just pelting down with rain. So I began to walk in the rain. But because of the amount of water, I was sort of looking at the floor as I walked, and I was just looking at the floor, not thinking about anything in particular. I was just zoned out, if you like, walking. I was not focusing on anything. And all of a sudden, it was like out of the blue. Suddenly, I was no longer in my body. My body was walking, and I was in the air, about 50 meters, I would say, off the ground, looking down at myself, walking along the road, under the street lights. This lasted perhaps a few seconds. It felt like minutes. And then all of a sudden, bang, I was back inside my body. I stopped dead. I was like, what the hell happened? I turned around, I looked up in the sky. I was completely bewildered. What had happened to me? I actually walked back down the road and walked up the road a second time, but nothing happened. So I let it go and off I went. A few days later, I saw a poster for transcendental meditation, and I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. And so transcendental meditation, TM, is something that was founded by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. So I went and I joined, and I paid some money, and they taught me an I am meditation. So this wasn't anything terribly exciting. They just gave me a mantra, and my mantra happened to be I am. And they told me I should meditate on that. When I meditate, they said, I will just repeat in my mind this same thing. I am. And then thoughts would appear. First of all, I would lose the meditation, and the thoughts would control me. And after a little while, I would become aware that the thoughts were in control, and the meditation was stopped. They told me, don't fight with myself, just start meditating again. And after a few minutes, the same thing will happen. And if you keep doing this long enough, eventually you will be able to meditate for hours on end without interference from thoughts. And so I gave this a good try. It was at this time that I was in the streets of Grahamstown when there was a Hare Krishna man, a devotee, and he was busy dancing, jumping in the air, looked like he was having a party all on his own. And he had these cymbals and he was singing Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. And he was jumping all over the place. And when he saw me, he stopped and he came over and he put his hand in his little bag where he kept his beads. And he pulled out this book and he said, "This is for you." And I said to him, "Must I give you some money?" And he said, No, this is a present, read this book. And what it was a book on how to master astral travel by the founder of the International Society of Krishna Consciousness. And I didn't know what that was. And his name was A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. So I read this book and it was very interesting because what he said in the book was very similar to what my father had taught me years before. So I immediately entered into this twilight state of consciousness and attempted to astral travel. At first, just a few meters. So I would move out of my body and move a meter or two or three, and little by little I got further and further until I was successfully able to travel 900 kilometers to visit my wife, and where we could communicate 900 kilometers away. But I was under the misconception that I was traveling somewhere. What I didn't know is I was traveling nowhere. And I never ever left my body at all. I just expanded my consciousness, and that all of us have one consciousness. This consciousness is God, and that we can all commune because we are one. But I didn't understand any of that. I physically thought I had found a way to remove myself from my body, take my spiritual body out of my physical body and physically travel across the universe, and I could go to all sorts of places, which in reality I was doing. And this has happened to me many, many times in my life. So it is not an isolated event. So this was quite an enlightening process. I then was hitchhiking again, but this time I was traveling from Grahamstown to Durban to go and visit my wife. We weren't married at this point. And while I was busy hitchhiking, a man came riding on a bike along the road. And he never said anything to me, not like the person who we could consider a ghost or an angel before. But this man just rode his bike straight along the road and went past. And when I turned, he was gone. And it was only quite a long time afterwards that I discovered that in Grahamstown they actually have ghost tours, and that there are many, many ghosts in Grahamstown. It's the most haunted city in southern Africa. I didn't know this at the time, but I knew that this was something special that had happened, but I didn't know much about it. Now in 1979, I was conscripted by the South African Defence Force. At that particular time, in apartheid South Africa, it was compulsory for every white male to go into the army for 2 years. Now, I had no interest in being in the army, and if I'd had a choice, I would never have gone. However, every white South African was faced with a choice. 2 years in the army or 3 years in jail and a criminal record for the rest of your life. In other words, you could never get a job, you would just be shunned by the community, etc. So there was no alternative but to complete the 2 years service. And in order to ensure that I was not required to shoot anybody, which would be completely against who I am and what I believe, as soon as I went into the infantry, I volunteered to become a driver, and I drove all different sized trucks, armored cars, trucks, delivery vehicles, things like that, and even forklift trucks. While I was in the army, I got more involved with the International Society of Krishna Consciousness, which was started, as I said before, by A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. I went to the Kaita Ridge Ashram and learned a tremendous amount about pure Hinduism, about the Bhagavad Gita, which I've read, and a little about a set of books called the Srimad Bhagavatam, which I know very little. But while I was there, one of the tasks that has to be done in ashram is you have to look after the cows. And one day I was with the cows, and this devotee came over, and he was aware that I was still eating meat at that time. And he said to me, if I gave you a knife, would you be able to kill this cow? And obviously I couldn't. Once you've cared for a cow and you've looked into those incredible eyes, there is no way that you could kill that animal. So I became a vegetarian from that day. By vegetarian I mean no meat, no fish. But I'm a bit of an unusual vegetarian, as I don't eat fruit either. So I only eat vegetables. But whether you are a vegetarian or not, that doesn't hamper your spiritual progress, but it does change the way you view things and the way you behave. Now, Judaism has also had a marked impact on my life. And it started in 1974 when a most unusual thing happened. I was standing on the side of the road hitchhiking. This seems to be a common trend. And a person was standing at the bus stop. I didn't know him, never seen him before. He was an unusual person. He was quite tall, much taller than me, and he had quite big ears, and he had unusual features. And he walked over to me and he said, "Hi, my name is Michael, and I've been sent to guide you." And that was quite a shock for me. I didn't know what that meant. Anyway, we started talking, and he invited me to his home, where I went and found his parents were Jewish, he was Jewish, his family is Jewish, and these people were completely alien to me. But they openly discussed God and the Torah, and I was welcome. And they had a rabbi in the family, and we had many great discussions. And this was an opening to me finding my roots. Because in 1974, when my grandmother and mother heard that I was discussing Judaism my grand said, "Well, you are Jewish, you know." And I was shocked. My brother didn't know, and my mother didn't know very little about it, but my grand discussed what had happened after the Second World War and how they had made a decision that they would not be persecuted, and they changed their name. So if I had not started to study Judaism, perhaps I would never have found out. So I began to study the Torah. I went to a Jewish bookshop and I bought a Torah and I started studying it, which I found extremely difficult, not knowing any Hebrew. And the Torah that I bought had both Hebrew and English, which is extremely complicated because the Hebrew Bible or Torah is written backwards, which was again foreign to me. But little by little I began to understand and to appreciate and to see the depth to the 5 books of Moses. Then I started to learn Kabbalah. I began to discover the tree of good and evil and the tree of life. And slowly but surely my depth of understanding of Jewish mysticism started to grow. Eventually I came to a point where I needed a book called the Zohar. This book is called the Book of Splendor. I didn't know why I needed this book, but I knew this book was important. And I tried it. Today, anybody can go on the internet and download the book. But at that point in time, it was a secret. And it couldn't be accessed by any non-Jewish person. In actual fact, a Jewish person couldn't get it either. It had to be over the age of 40. So I went and made an appointment at a synagogue in Johannesburg, and I went to see the chief rabbi of Hasidic Judaism and went to ask if I could have the Zohar. And I had to have an in-depth meeting and discussion which lasted about 3 hours, when I explained my roots and my understanding of Kabbalah and why I needed this book. And he granted me the book, and I began learning in earnest. But in 1992, due to political and social pressures, we decided to move as a family to England. Arriving in England, my primary focus was to set up. We arrived with suitcases, and so first things first was to get the work under control, the home environment under control, children in school, all these types of things. But my spirituality never went away. So I was in charge of the facilities management at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and there I was exposed to many Christian relics and all sorts of interesting stuff there. So I grew a little bit there. I read the Celestine Prophecy at that time, and I realized something different, that I was always under the impression that I was separate, that inside of me there was a spirit or a soul, and every other person had one of these things, and we were all separate. But from the book, I don't know if that's what I was supposed to learn from it, but I learned from it that we are one, and that there's an inclusion, and that my spiritual being is not separate from other people, and that we are one. So I started to reevaluate my understanding of my out-of-body experiences and my understanding of the spiritual events that had happened. So then I went to a pagan ritual to just go and see what they're about. And when I was there, I realized that they have incredibly strong spiritual energy that can be utilized for all sorts of different things, but extremely powerful. But it wasn't for me. So one visit to a solstice was enough for me. But I realized that when I was there, they had a great effect on me, even though I never participated. I was purely a spectator. I learnt to do the tarot, and I learnt the Merlin spread, and found there was a certain connection between people. The person doing the cards and the person wanting the reading entered into a relationship of sharing, and so that was quite extraordinary. And then a marked spiritual event happened to me. I went to Camden Town in London, and while I was there, there was a card reader doing tarot, and he had a customer. And I stood outside of his shop, but I could see through the door, and I could see behind the curtain, which was slightly open. I could see him and his customer, and they were doing the reading. And I opened my awareness to encapsulate the entire shop and the people in it. And while I was doing this, I became aware of the reader, and he shouted at me in my mind. And then he came to the door of the shop. He stopped the reading, he came out of the door, and he sort of put his hands on his hips. He was a bit upset, and he said, "Do you mind? I'm trying to do a reading." And I apologized profusely and walked away, and then realized that what I had done is extremely rude and invasive, and I had entered into another person's space without their permission. So that was something else I learned, that possessions and things like that were possible in a certain circumstance. But I still didn't understand enough. But it was certainly a marked event in my spiritual path. While we were in England, I worked for a company that had many contracts. And one of these contracts was all the cell phone towers in the entire UK. And I was tasked with the job of doing a survey of all these cells in a cellular network. So this was quite a mammoth thing to do. And I had to go to all of these buildings throughout England, Scotland, and Wales. So I asked the company if my wife could accompany me, and she would drive me, and then I would do these things, which allowed her to visit all these towns and do a bit of shopping and a bit of sightseeing. And we did a little bit of that together, but it was mainly a work trip. During this time, we went through many places, many quaint little towns, churches, that kind of thing. Also, while I was in England, I climbed Ben Nevis, the largest mountain in the UK, climbed Mount Snowdon, the largest mountain in Wales, and Scafell Pike, the highest mountain in England. I've read many books, but even with all this outdoor activity and a vibrant lifestyle, I became ill. There was no cause to my illness. The doctors couldn't find out what was wrong, but my heart would stop beating from time to time. So I was walking around with a ECG machine connected. So I had this little black box in the middle of my back with all the wires on my chest. And for almost a year, I was living in a dark cloud. But what I didn't know, and only discovered afterwards, is this building that I was working in, called the Milton House, was across the road from the London City Mortuary. And it had been established there for many, many years before it moved. And I was being affected by spirits. So a psychic person, a person that had spent years trying to hone my ability to feel and be aware of my environment, was inside of a domain bombarded with many thousands of spirits, and I was deeply unwell, and it affected me, and it brought a dark cloud over our family. My company relocated me away to a different site, quite a few different sites over a period of time. My health improved and things started to get better. In 1999 we returned to South Africa, and it was at this time that I developed a model which was a model of a fish living in the ocean. So this was a way of me conceptualizing my understanding of who God was in relation to me. So basically I was a fish in the ocean. So as a fish in the ocean, God is on the outside of me, all around me, and God is inside of me. God is what I eat, God is what I drink. I cannot survive without God. But this model had a limitation, is that there was a boundary. There was God inside me and there was God outside of me. And obviously the God inside of me and the God outside of me was the same God, so I should have realized that there was actually no separation. But I had this model of separation, that all the fish in the sea were separate, though God pervaded through all people, all creatures, all things, whether they were alive or not. So I began to expand on this model and this understanding of consciousness, and my understanding was that there's only one rule in life, and I called it the first rule of life, and that is do no harm. So my understanding of no boundary between God and me, this, by me I don't mean me, Gary Eagle, the story, but the consciousness that's inside of me is the same consciousness, God's consciousness, because I cannot exist without God, because God is. So I began to understand that there was no distinction, and that Gary Eagle is the personality of this body, and this body is God in a finite form. So everything, whether it be a tree or an animal or anything in matter, was God. Anything in spiritual form, whether it be called a soul or a spirit, anything that is conscious is God, and that there is nothing other than God. This got me to think that if God is, then the past doesn't exist. Who has ever been in the past? Is there a past? There was a different present moment than there is now. And there was a different present moment than the current one a certain period of time ago. But is there a past? There isn't. It's our imagination. And if there's a present moment, is there a future? No. But in a certain amount of time from now, the present moment will be different. We call that the future. But there isn't a future. There is always only one thing, which is the present moment. So, God lives, is in the present. I am in the present. There is no past, there is no future, there is just now. I started to contemplate further. I never ever believed that the purpose of life was to sit on a mountain and hide from the world. The purpose of mastering your life was to be able to master your mind. To master one's body is easy, but to master your mind is the hardest thing any human being could ever attempt to do. If we don't control our mind and we are a slave to our mind, we pay a terrible price. We will suffer ill health. We will be plagued with fear and worry. We will be indecisive. We will have frustrations. And we will face discouragement throughout our life. We will always be not fulfilled. We will suffer poverty and want. Irrespective of how much money you have, you want more. Want all the time. And a whole flock of evil things which will plague us, such as greed, jealousy, anger, hatred, superstition. All of these things will plague us if we don't control our mind. So can we control our mind? Is it possible? Can we stop our thoughts? If we try to stop our thoughts, who will stop them? We will use our mind we will think, I must stop my thoughts. So we're going to try to use thought to stop thoughts. Well, obviously that's a fool's game and never going to work. So how do we go about trying to control our mind? Well, the solution is the present moment. If at any point in time we bring our attention out of the past and we don't think about the future, but we focus on now, immediately the mind stops thinking. Thought only occurs in the past or the future. Thought cannot occur in the present moment. So we have to think about, how do we stay present? Remember, what I discovered is that God is present. He resides in the present moment, not in the past, not in the future, in the present moment. And that's where we need to be, in God's presence. So, if we go to this effort of trying to control our mind, why would we do it? Could we achieve? What would be the reward for controlling our mind? Well, everything opposite to what we said before. So, having a sound health, mental health, physical health, peace of mind, peace, tranquility, calm inside of our mind. We could focus our attention on activities we love to do. They would be our own choice. We would be free from fear and worry, limitations. We would have a positive mental attitude. We would have all the riches that we want, as much as we want. Perhaps I should qualify that. When you reach this state of mental control, you no longer desire any material riches. So, but if you were to desire something, there's nothing stopping you. There's no limitation imposed on your ability to achieve. You are free. I'm now in a situation where I understand my own awareness. I can observe my thoughts when I want them. I can still my thoughts when I don't. Will I ever gain complete mastery of my mind? Probably not. But that's okay, because the reality is that this world that we live in is continuously changing and challenging us. And as the world challenges you, you'll learn new lessons. And I don't believe the world will ever run out of challenges for any person. I think we all caught a wake up with COVID-19, and I don't think it's the last trick that the world can play on humanity. And there will always be more life challenges. Many people are afraid that as you enter into continuous awareness, that you stop functioning as a person, you stop interacting with your family, and stop enjoying the value of life. But that is not true. The value increases day by day. This overview has given you basic understanding of my spiritual journey. It's something that will never end till my final breath, whenever that is. My current focus is to share knowledge that I have with whoever needs guidance. I'm opposed to providing more and more teachings, as I think there's hundreds of thousands of people who are going from book to book, YouTube video to YouTube video, on a continual quest, thinking that through your own activity you can find this mastery of who you are and find God in your life. But that is not possible. You can never find God with your mind, because your mind is an illusion, and the only way is through self-inquiry. You have to physically stop trying and just surrender into the stillness, and God will be revealed to you. But you cannot become self-realized. You cannot find God. You cannot be anything else other than present and being aware of the fact that you're alive in this moment.